I am subscribed to the Desiring God mailing list and often read the words of John Piper, who responds to questions about Christian doctrine from curious believers. Through the mailing list, I became aware of an article on Piper's website entitled "Does God Control All Things All the Time?" I was excited to discover that Piper had written on this subject, as it's an area of particular philosophical interest to me. I was genuinely intrigued to read what Piper had to say about this question, which cuts right into the heart of Christian theology. As I read through the article, I found myself in almost total agreement. I agree that God works out all things according to his will, that God governs all human plans and acts, and that everything that Satan does must ultimately be under God's control. I tend to agree with a lot of what Calvinists like Piper say about God's sovereignty. But just as Piper was concluding his response to the question, he made a statement which I think highlights why I could not ultimately describe myself as a Calvinist. He said this: "God's sovereignty does not diminish our accountability." Alarm bells immediately started ringing in my mind, and my heart sank as I read these words, which represent a confusion at the heart of Calvinist thinking. Earlier in the article, Piper had made another statement along the same lines. He said, "Even in situations where God is permitting, he is permitting by design." Are you able to see the contradiction that exists in these two quoted statements? You see, Calvinists want to strongly state God's sovereignty, and they do so by insisting that salvation is solely a work of God. But the trouble is, we only need to be saved because of rebellion against God, and that rebellion implies freedom of the human will. Without God's sovereignty, Calvinism doesn't make sense, but with God's sovereignty, Christianity doesn't make sense. It's simple. If we are free to sin, then God is not in control of our lives, so we cannot call him sovereign. If we are not free to sin, and our lives are under God's control, then the need for salvation, and therefore the whole Christian gospel, evaporates. Calvinists would have to deny what I affirm, which is that we are merely puppets in the hands of God. I believe all of creation is part of God. He is omnipresent, and that is what true sovereignty means. We have to be able to affirm this truth about God and deal with the implications for our theology, which are far-reaching. Reformed Christian thinkers with a high view of God's sovereignty will often try to sneak in free will through the metaphorical back door by arguing that prior to salvation we are dead in our sins and under the bondage of the will. Such phrases are a veiled attempt to deny that God is in control of our sins, and Calvinists cling to such phrases because, as I've just argued, the Christian worldview doesn't make sense if God is wholly in control. The truth of the matter is that we are not so much slaves to sin as slaves to God, who is in control of every aspect of our lives from our conception, and including those aspects of our behaviour that Christians might describe as sinful. Do you believe that God is in control of those aspects of our lives that Christians describe as sinful? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. In the next video, we'll be looking at a theological perspective called Molinism, which uses a kind of trick of logic to try to make sense of the divine sovereignty versus human free will problem. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. This video series accompanies my new book titled God's Grand Game, which is available now from all major retailers. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the bell to be notified of future videos.